Hi, my name is Paul. I'm the pastor of Living Stones Christian Reformed Church in Sacramento, California, and I'm doing a commentary series on Jordan Peterson's biblical series, The Psychological Significance of the Bible. And by series number one, the introduction to the idea of God is really prolegomena. He's really setting the groundwork for it. Now, I've been part of what I'm doing this commentary basically along similar lines to Peterson in terms of trying to figure this out, and I'm using YouTube and trying to see if this is a fruitful platform for me to do some thinking out loud, to articulate some things. And I've really appreciated the comments that I've gotten so far on the past videos that I've done. So if you enjoy these rather rambling, working things out in my head as I go, just let me know. I'll keep doing them. So far, I think I've grown a lot in terms of figuring out what this platform is, how this works, and maybe I'll do some more reflecting on that as we go forward. But one of the things that I've been thinking about is how Jordan Peterson is upsetting the battle lines that are entrenched. I almost think about World War I in terms of the American Christian scene. There's basically two sides. There's the main line and the fundamentalists. Now, I'm not including the Orthodox, the Roman Catholics, and evangelicals are sometimes fundamentalists and sometimes they're more moderate. The Christian Reformed Church that I serve is kind of in the middle. It's a historic immigrant denomination that came over from the Netherlands. Its first splits came in the Netherlands over modernity. Some of the initial splits of the denomination, in Dutch, the afscheiding and the doleantie, where local church leaders were troubled by liberalism in the Netherlands in the 19th century, and they split off. And so these battle lines have been going not only in North America but in Europe, and right now it kind of sets where you've got the main line versus the fundamentalists. Those are kind of the two poles, and of course it's way more complex than that. But just for the sake of discussion, we'll look at those two poles. And one of the things that I reflect on is that I would imagine that a lot of people assume when I first tell them about Jordan Peterson that he would feel at home with the main line, because mainline interpretation recently tends to resist literalism and embrace symbolic interpretations. They don't have any problem with Darwin or science, but increasingly for the mainline, their faith expression is very activistic politically and very much aligns with what I call progressive liberationism. And so if you go to a mainline church, it depends. The main line is huge but shrinking fast. If you go to a mainline church, you'll probably see people who basically say, well, we traditionally are Christians and we might still do something with the liturgy, but how we practice the gospel, how we practice our love for Jesus in the world will be along the same lines as, and then you can go down the list. They might, sanctuary movements, LGBT, a number of the lines that basically align, say, in the United States with the Democratic Party. Now, initially, a lot of people that I listen to who have either drifted to the main line or in the main line say our particular context should be perfect for us because we align so much with what seems to be the ascendant morality of progressive liberationism in the United States today. The difficulty that they face is that for many people within the secular frame, why would you need the church when you have, let's say, the Democratic Party? I mean, if we might say that on the Republican side, the fundamentalist churches are the Republicans at prayer, well, the mainline churches are the Democrats at prayer. And so one of the things that we've been seeing is this division in the church that has followed the political division, and I find that reprehensible. In my own congregation, there are some very conservative Republicans, and there are some very liberal Democrats, and we all maintain, it's a small congregation, but we all maintain ourselves here in the body of Christ, and some who are Democrats that say the church has to follow these certain issues and get activistic about it, they'll come here and they'll not find a place here because that's not what we do. And then I've had others leave who say, Pastor, what you really need to do is call out people on these Republican issues, and I'll tell them that's not what we're going to do when we're worshiping God on Sunday. And if you look at my sermons, you'll notice that I often use a lot of political references. I don't shy away from engaging in what's happening in our contemporary space. How can we not? But I am not going to carry water for either the Democrats or the Republicans. I, of course, have my own political views, and right now, increasingly, I feel myself, I don't have a party I can really align or identify with wholeheartedly, but I think that's always been the case. But Peterson comes around, and in many ways, a lot of people initially think, well, he should pretty much align up with the mainline churches because he embraces science. He embraces symbolic reading of the Bible. I know a lot of my conservative friends, when they listen to some of the things he says, well, I can't go on with this guy because he's not really down with me in terms of the Bible. But I also listen to others. So the more fundamentalist camp likes literalistic interpretation, hates Darwin. Since the 80s, have gotten involved in politics, but value spiritual activities like prayer, evangelism, going to church, giving money to causes, helping the poor. Fundamentalists and religious conservatives are very much nested within their frame, their conception. And as hopefully I continue to work through Peterson, I'm going to really try to dig into this question of representation and then practice in terms of what does it mean to be a Christian in our contemporary context. And I don't believe it means to be the Democratic Party at prayer, and I don't think it means to be the Republican Party at prayer, and I don't think we can simply shelve 2,000 years of practice. It makes a lot of sense that you could see Jordan Peterson's relationship with John Pageau. I think I'm getting his last name right. And it makes sense because in many ways, the Orthodox Church, which is in many ways the oldest tradition, the Western Latin Church split off from the Eastern Church. The Eastern Church has had their own travails and their own path through Greece and through Russia and through that whole side. It makes a lot of sense that Peterson, at the video I'll show later in this program, Peterson finds himself in the pulpit with Orthodox Christians, and there's been some interesting things. The United States, as it has for the Jews, as it has for many religious groups, has been a fertile place for the Orthodox to kind of live past some of the stuff that they had to deal with in Greece, in the Middle East, in Russia, in the East. And so it's going to be very interesting to see what happens to the Orthodox Church. But this is why Peterson tends to cut across these views. So mainliners listen to Peterson and they complain because he's not lining up with progressive liberationism, and he's not lining up with them in other ways. And in fact, he's a critic of this Marxism that I think many in the mainline kind of default into because they act like human beings and we're all naturally tribal. And when we see people that we respect and are making the right noises, we tend to kind of follow along. And obviously, if you listen to Peterson, he's not lining up with that group. Yet fundamentalists listen to him and they say, the way he talks about the Bible, I don't expect to hear someone use Darwinistic evolution to justify a really literal, that's not literalistic, but it's justify a serious reading of Genesis 2 and 3. And so I think this is what's causing in this way Peterson is crossing this battlefield that it's all entrenched and there's a no man's land, and that's why in some ways Peterson's going to get shot at from both sides because he is in no man's land. And the same comes with the atheists and the Christians. A commenter posted a link to a Jonathan Haidt video from 2013 rehashing some of the stuff from the book that he published then, which was an excellent book. I read it and very much enjoyed it. But this is why atheists are saying, I want to look at Christians, and Christians who are a little antagonistic and afraid of Darwin are listening to Jordan Peterson and saying, he makes a lot of sense. And Christians like me who have never really found a home in either pole listen to this and say, we should listen to this. Is there a way forward? Is there something helpful that's coming down the road through this? Now, one of the things I listen for when I listen for Peterson are what I call gospel articulations. Now, one of the interesting things that you read about the Bible, when you read through the Bible, is there's this thing called the gospel, which Christians talk about, and it's good news. Now, I almost can't say those words in our contemporary frame, especially if you've got a lot of evangelicals around you, or even Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons. If you say gospel, people frame that in a certain frame of reference. But in the first century, that was a very interesting term to use, because it was, in the words of some of my Reformed brethren, the gospel is good news, not good advice. So if you listen to Tim Keller, you'll hear that phrase a lot. And if you look at, say, pastors in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church of America, which is the conservative split off, one of the conservative split offs of the PCUSA, or the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, which is the mainline group, the gospel is good news, not good advice. But the gospel is also something that and I think about Peterson and Jung here, where there's this dream state, and where we know more than we can articulate, and where we see this thing, and we're trying to figure out how this works for us, and then we put words on it. And in fact, you find that process in the Bible too. One of the most gospel-y books in the Old Testament is the prophet Jonah, and the theme sentence of the book of Jonah is, I think, the theme sentence of the Old Testament, and could in fact be a great thematic sentence of the Bible, which is salvation is of the Lord. Now you get into the synoptics, and Jesus walks around announcing, remember, not advising, announcing the kingdom of heaven. And in Matthew, or the kingdom of heaven in Matthew, the kingdom of God in Mark and Luke, and there are reasons for that. And then in John you get into eternal life, and John keeps talking about eternal life. And as we get into light and life, and all of the different ways that the Gospel of John rather uniquely frames this thing called the gospel. And Paul uses a variety of statements. One of the most innovative, an important one that Paul uses is being in Christ. And so the gospel, this gospel goes out, and every age has to try to articulate this and embody this and practice it. Yet, and I think the Orthodox does this well, the Orthodox Church does this well in their preservation of practice, that, and again, this is what helps me with Peterson, that this gospel doesn't just inhabit our brains through articulated speech. It's something that we know and can't put it into words, and it's something that we do with our body, and it's something that if you've been formed by it. Now, if you're reading James K. Smith, who is a popular author, philosophy professor at Calvin College, he's been working this neo-Augustinian ancient modern revival of talking about practice, and how we, Christian formation and practice. And this gets into, there's a whole bunch of, here's the thing about a pastor, that the Christian conversation is large and huge and ongoing. So what in many ways the church has been doing since 1500 is where, Charles Taylor talks about, the kind of the march of secularism moving on. In many ways, though, that the Christian church in the West, through fundamentalism and evangelicalism, has assumed kind of the medieval Christendom death anxiety. One of the things that, if you read a biography of Martin Luther, you see very clearly that Martin Luther is right at the end of medieval Christendom, and his faith journey, he goes from being someone who is going to be a lawyer to someone who decides to be a monk because of a thunderstorm, and he cries out to Saint Anne. And It's not the millennialism, the apocalyptic anxiety of the Middle Ages was just as palpable then as it was in the 19th century or even in the 20th century when prognosticators come forward and predict the end of the days. And so this anxiety about death has been within our culture. And so in the middle to part of the 20th century, Evangelism Explosion came out with their, and this is so quintessentially American, came out with their surefire way of making Christians, where you knock on the door and you say, if you were to die tonight, do you know where you'd go? Now living in blue state California, many people, if you say, if you were to die tonight, do you know where you'll go? People are either over here and say, well, I'll be gone because I'll just be dead. So I've got nothing to fear and I won't hurt. And this is, I think, part of the reason why suicide continues to creep up. Or others will simply have a moralistic therapeutic framework where they'll say, I've been a good person, I'll go to a better place, I don't know what that is, or they'll just grab things from Hollywood, Heaven Can Wait, or The Good Place, or It's a Wonderful Life, or anything off the shelf. And this practice that very much depended on medieval Catholicism, where there's this anxiety about death that was very much in the culture, very much in many ways, because life was short and people died often. Even when I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, almost any family I would know would have lost a child before the age of 5. Death was common, and so people were obviously very anxious about death. Here in secure, affluent North America, people aren't worried about death. And so this idea of, I'm going to church to get saved, which is implicitly connected with, I go to heaven when I die and not hell, well, this doesn't grab people anymore, and churches have been noticing this. So what happens as the culture changes, Christians, it's not just the matter of Christians taking a step back and saying, oh, we have to figure out how to do this different. Christians do that, but what happens more is that the cultural changes, they influence us, and we reframe the gospel different, and we come up with new things, and so you find various motivations from different cultural settings. Now, there's been updating in terms of missionary methods in the 80s and 90s. In the Protestant church, we had the seeker movement go through, which very much demythologized the setting. You took down all the crosses from church. You met in something. If you visit, say, Willow Creek, you met in something that looked something like a community college. And Bill Hybels would say, we're going to create a safe space, which I listen to now, 30 years later. We're going to create a safe space for people to encounter a dangerous message. And Bill Hybels wanted to create fully formed disciples of Jesus Christ. But in many ways, the basic framework from medieval Christianity updated into American evangelicalism was basically the same. So you'd have contemporary music, you had a lot of wisdom preaching to try and give the Bible credibility, but then when you'd sit down with someone, you'd lead them through the Roman road or the 4 spiritual laws, which tended to be, I think, the late stage modernist conception, which was an adaptation of medieval Christianity. So, at least early Protestant Christianity or Protestant Christianity. And then after that, we've had the movement, the emergent movement, which really split into two. There's kind of the conservative, liturgical, ancient, modern, and then the more liberal wing that has fully braced progressive liberationism, if only a little bit behind them. So, and when I talk to people in the Midwest and they think of a church plant or a new church, they think about, say, a suburban evangelical, non-denominational, big box church, which will tend to be just kind of an incremental updating of the seeker movement. Now, many of the new churches that are getting a lot of traction with younger people, now you've got liturgy, you've got communion every Sunday, you're talking about practice, you're putting ashes on for Holy Week. And this is part of the reason that, again, and we've seen this all along, you see an increasing interest in the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, but many Americans, many Americans are not down for the kind of rigors that these older traditions and denominations demand of people. If you're really going to be a Roman Catholic, it's a pretty big demanding package. If you're really going to be, going to the Orthodox Church, it's a pretty big demanding package. And many Americans want a religion where they can slide it on Sunday, listen to a little message, feel a little different, and then, go somewhere with it. But in all fairness, the fundamentalist or the evangelical program is also a pretty significant demanding package. And as I think Christendom continues to fade and levels of chaos increasingly rise in people's lives, I think a lot of the people, I just found an interesting YouTuber who's documenting on YouTube. I can't remember his name, documenting on YouTube exactly what he's doing as he's sorting himself out and keeping his room clean, and hopefully he's going to get a job and move out of his parents' house and get a girlfriend and then get a wife and then have a kid and go on and do something which 50 years ago nobody had to even think about, because we had a culture that they could simply ride on and do it. So we've seen this migration of Christianity, and part of what I wonder is whether or not Peterson is going to be part of a new synthesis, because he's, on one hand, he's got his unapologetic embrace of contemporary science. He is a scientist, and he follows Darwin, and he embraces Nietzsche, and so on one hand he's got that, yet which again, you would think he would drift over towards the main line, but he's resisting he's not only resisting it, he's calling it out, he's railing against it. If you want to get him excited, poke him here and off he goes. Because he's a child like me, he's a child of the 80s, he remembers the Cold War. I don't know if I was as traumatized by him, by the Cold War. Maybe he was more traumatized by it. I don't know, but or it's just his personality. Off he goes. That's in a sense, that's part of why it's so fun to watch him, to listen to his rants and listen to him rail. So he's not going to align with the main line. And there's an ancient modern synthesis in terms of his symbolism and mythology. And again, I see some of this in C.S. Lewis. And Lewis was, Lewis, I think in many ways was one of the most powerful Christian apologists in the 20th century. And it was amazing watching, for example, evangelicals and even fundamentalists. Fundamentalists got a leery. Evangelicals are often kind of watered down fundamentalists. They don't fit in the main line. They're not really hardcore. They're trying to work the synthesis. And it was amazing in the 20th century how many evangelicals embraced C.S. Lewis. And here's a guy, if you looked at C.S. Lewis's actual beliefs, well, he was an Anglican. He's a little anti-Roman Catholic in some ways, but clearly believed in evolution, had some interesting ideas about the second coming, and some people think, snuck in some universalistic stuff from George MacDonald, who is one of C.S. Lewis's heroes. And so in many ways, C.S. Lewis is a strange mascot and hero for evangelicals, but he became one. And in some ways, I see Jordan Peterson in that same way, because he is, as C.S. Lewis did, he is working this other angle and basically connecting the church to far older, broader conversations. And I think Peterson is right, and there's something there, in terms of what Jung found, that there's a firmware level to us, and some of it maybe got down into our hardware. There's a firmware level to us in which all of this stuff in the Bible connects with us in a deep way in these selves behind us that Jung talks about, and we don't have it. I've got a mosquito in here, and I've got to talk about malaria on Sunday, but that we don't really have figured out. And so I think, I do wonder, and I know some of my friends think I'm nuts for this, but I do wonder if Peterson is onto something, and if like Lewis, now Peterson is flowering now in the 21st century, if he's doing something that is important and doing something that's going to be valuable not only in terms of the conversational, the intellectual conversational life of the church, but the question will be whether any of these thoughts will actually get into practice within the churches. So, yeah, question of practice. Now I know, reading comments and listening to friends, a lot of conservative Christians have heresy anxiety about Jordan Peterson, and I can understand that. Jordan Peterson is being very authentic about what he believes and very honest. And again, if you listen to him, you know why he's being honest. And I frankly respect that kind of honesty and the kind of duplicity and disingenuous practice. Here's a difficult thing about being a human being. In order for a religious tradition to really grip you, it's got to be demanding. There's a guy, I can't remember his name right now. He's doing a little thing called the masculinist, and he had an interesting one on basically religions, and part of the problem with a lot of Protestant religions, especially the mainline, some evangelicals, not as much the fundamentalists, is that these religions aren't taken seriously enough to really grip you. And so part of that package is you formed by the subculture, and you develop pretty sharp antibodies within you about practice and about dogma. And this is part of what gives your religion strength. But it's also, this gets into the boundary stuff and the border stuff that Peterson talks about. It also makes you reactive. And so if you're temperamentally, like me, kind of high in openness, that makes being a member of a conservative religious tradition both an asset in terms of this is something real to grab hold of, but also a liability, because on one hand, I've got some stuff to work through. And so, will Jordan Peterson pronounce heresy? I think absolutely. I think we all do. And one of the fun things is that if you know enough theology and you know enough church history, you can often find the most ardent fundamentalists and ardent, people who are down for their tradition, most determined within their tradition, spouting heresy without them knowing it. I see it all the time in the church. But what is heresy? This is from Alistair McGrath's terrific book on heresy. So what is heresy? Heresy is best seen as a form of Christian belief that, more by accident than divine design, ultimately ends up subverting, destabilizing, or even destroying the core of the Christian faith. Both this process of destabilization and the identification of its threat may be spread out over an extended period of time, which means that there's a lot of trial and error in theology, and there's a lot of trial and error in the Christian church. And if you read the New Testament closely, you can get a sense of that. You get the sense that the New Testament was a wild place, and Paul comes into a synagogue and kind of starts preaching about the resurrection of Jesus. That kind of tear things up, and some God-fearers start to believe, and then some full-blown Gentiles come in, and some of the Jews come in, and the Jews are having a lot of anxiety about these Gentiles, and in Acts 15, the Jerusalem church has to weigh into it, and it's a messy place. And when I look at the kinds of challenges that Christendom and the Christian church is going to be facing for the next 100 years, it is going to be a messy place. Well, it has been a messy place. We've just kept things neat and compartmentalized with denominations. So you've got the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox and how many tens of thousands of Protestant denominations. And so it is a messy place. But in the very long view, these things get worked out. And so, I'm not going to tell people don't sharpen your ears with respect to heresy. It's good to challenge. What we're not going to do is put anybody on any stakes and burn them up. But it's good to talk these things through, and it's good to challenge. And so that's part of my motivation in this commentary series on Jordan Peterson is I want to talk back, and I want to challenge some things. And some things he says, and I think, oh man, that's right. And that challenges other parts of my matrix and my framework. And sometimes he says things and I say, that can't be right. And sometimes I hear him say things and that, well, that's just wrong. So, but this is the process, and this is the process by which we grow together. Now, again, I've done 3 videos. The first video, Why Bother, which is really the prolegomena to the prolegomena. That was one of the first videos I did with this new format, and there are a lot of sound problems. I've got a lot of comments about those sound problems. I'm sorry. Maybe I'll go back and redo that video at some point, but I'm much more of I'm not a very good editor. I do one take with things, and then I move on because I do these things because they interest me. I don't have a Patreon account. I'm the pastor of a church, and so I'm, in little pieces of time, I carve out time to do these little videos, and then there might be a little while where I don't do one because I've got my day job to do. But I'm trying to work through this Jordan Peterson stuff, and I guess I found him late summer. I jumped in the summer series. I guess it was July, so I've been in this thing 6 months now, and I'm not tired of it yet, so I'm going to keep working on it. So the first video was Why Bother? And the second video was, I looked at Nietzsche and Peterson and Harris and Weinstein. And the third video, I looked at Jung, because Jung's been fascinating me. I didn't know much about Jung, and so I'm reading his autobiography now. Now that really goes up to minute 47 in Peterson's videos. And Peterson rambles, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because I'm doing the same thing right now. But there's a segment from minute 47 to minute 105 when it's pretty disorganized, and I haven't quite figured out if I'm going to treat that section, if I'm just going to let it run and add some comments to that section. There's a lot of interesting stuff in that section, a lot of stuff that's duplicated from his other videos, but I haven't quite sure if I'm going to treat that, if I'm going to take the time to do that or not. Then there's Peterson's approach, which is more structured, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in there too. I haven't dealt with that, but I'm a pastor, and so I have to preach this Sunday on John 1. And so I thought, oh, good. I want to kill 2 birds with one stone. So Peterson talks about the Logos in John 1, and so I thought, since I have to study this week anyway to prepare for my sermon, I thought I might jump in and just do that section now. So this is Peterson on Logos.
Okay, now, to understand the first part of Genesis, I'm going to turn, strangely enough.
Now again, he's going to try to start the Bible, which he can't really do in this first one, which is hilarious, and it's endearing and it's adorable in many ways, because when he said, I'm going to go through the whole Bible and these 12 things, I'm thinking, you're not even going to get close. You're not even going to get halfway through the book of Genesis. Especially Genesis. It's such an amazing book. It's such a fertile book. You're not even going to get there. So he's going to start with Genesis, and now he's going to interestingly jump right to John 1 and the Logos.
To something that's actually part of the New Testament, and this is a central element of Christianity. And it's a very strange idea, and it's going to take a very long time to unpack, but the idea...
And he says it's going to take a long time to unpack, and here's the thing about Peterson, I'm starting to try to organize. Okay, so I'm bringing some logos to his chaos as I watch through these videos, and there's a lot of chaos, and so he doesn't always follow through with some of these things, which again is fine. He's doing exactly what he's told us he wants to do, and so I'm thrilled he's doing it.
Idea. This is what John said about Christ. He said, "In the beginning was the Word," and so that relates back to Genesis 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Three sentences like that take a lot of unpacking, because, well, none of that seems to make any sense whatsoever, really, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was both with God, and the Word was God. So the first question might be, what in the world does that mean? In the beginning was the Word. That's the Logos, actually. And the Logos is embodied in the figure of Christ. So there's this idea in John that whatever...
Now, after I get through, I'm going to do a lot more talking about the Logos, because this is a big deal.
Whatever Christ is, the Son of God, is not only instantiated in history, say at a particular time and place as a carpenter in some backwoods part of the world, but also something eternal that exists outside of time and space that was there right at the beginning. And as far as I can tell, what that logos represents is something like modern people. It's something like what modern people refer to when they talk about consciousness. It's something like that. It's more than that. It's like consciousness and its capacity to be aware and its capacity to communicate.
That's such an interesting interpretation of the logos that I think you'd only get from a someone who, you know, has a PhD in psychology and studies this. And I find that I find that so intriguing and refreshing, and you know, I'd really that's it's just fascinating.
It's something like that, and there's an idea underneath that, which is that being, especially from a phenomenological perspective, so the being that is experience, cannot exist without consciousness. It's like consciousness shines a light on things to bring it into being. Because without consciousness, what is there? No one experiences anything.
And two, I think this is so intriguing to me. And I think about that idea. One of the things I often think about, but part of a question I often deal with in terms of the subjective is, here's the question: can I know myself? In some ways, my wife and my kids know me better than I know myself. In another way, I know myself better than my wife and my kids can, because obviously I'm from the inside. And so then you have the question: what am I? Who am I? Can I be known? And then you have the Christian idea of the audience of one. And when I think about, say, the resurrection, that God would knit me back together with the body, and I think you could only knit someone back together if you really knew them. And then in the Christian tradition, you say, you know, basically the logos, the Peterson's connecting with it here, and I'd never connected that with the logos before, but here only God can really know us, because only God can actually transcend the objective and the subjective, and only God could finally know Paul Vanderklay better than Paul Vanderklay can know himself, better than his wife or his kids could know him, better than his best friends could know him, and that kind of knowledge, and even better than I can be known in this realm of rebellion and sin. And so this idea of, you know, is there anything unless there's a seer? Well, if you're a Christian, there's a divine seer. Now, what does that mean?
It's like, is there anything when no one experiences anything? That's the question. And the answer that this book is presenting is that, no, you have to think about consciousness as a constituent element of reality. It's something that's necessary for reality itself to exist. Now, of course, it depends on what you mean by reality. But the reality that's being referred to here, I told you already, is this strange amalgam of the subjective experience and the world. But the question is deeper than that, too, because it is by no means obvious what there is if there's no one to experience it.
When he said the strange amalgam between the subjective and the world, he was referring back to chaos, as he was talking about, that chaos is the strange amalgam between the subjective and the world. And I think that, too, that's such a helpful insight. And when we actually start digging into Genesis 1, I think we're going to have to talk about chaos and yeah, well, and when I
mean, the whole notion of time itself seems to collapse, at least in terms of something like felt duration.
And again, you can read C.S. Lewis on time. Nobody knows how this stuff works. I mean, Peterson that's one of the things I appreciate about him. He is dead on right that there's so much of this stuff we just simply don't know.
The notion of size disappears essentially because there's nothing to scale it, and the causality seems to vanish. And so, and we don't understand consciousness, not in the least. We don't understand what it is that is in us that gives illumination to being.
And this is where, you know, I've been started reading again C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, and the naturalist, as C.S. Lewis talks about, and I want to go through that first chapter and define that term pretty sharply. The naturalist finally has a problem I think with consciousness. And again, that's back in my Jungian committee back there, and they're still working on that. But that's something that I think is true.
And what happens in the Old Testament, at least in part, is that that consciousness is associated with the divine. Now you think, well, is that a reasonable proposition? And that's a very complicated question, but at least we might note that there's something to the claim, because there is a miracle of experience and existence that's dependent on consciousness. I mean, people try to explain it away constantly, but it doesn't seem to work very well. And here's something else to think about, I think, that's really worth thinking about. People do not like it when you treat them like they're not conscious, right? They react very badly to that.
And again, this is part of what I really enjoy about Peterson, is that we've been dealing with a rather esoteric thing, and now he comes down to a tremendously practical aspect, which a clinician would know, and which a pastor would know, and which a social worker and a doctor and a nurse would know. That what is this about us that, dang it, we demand to be treated in a certain way.
And then you don't like it if someone assumes that you're not conscious, and you don't like it if someone assumes that you don't have free will. You know.
And this, again, when you look at a lot of the interesting brain books that have been written, I mean, free will is very much up for debate in a whole community there. But yet, it's almost impossible to imagine our civilization and our entire mode of being without the assumption of free will. And this is, again, where we are so deeply embedded in our culture and in our past that Peterson is dead right that you don't just throw this away. And that's why Nietzsche is right in that, hey, you're living off it, baby. You going to admit that, or you're just going to continue to live in denial?
That you're just absolutely determined in your actions, and there's nothing that's going to repair you, and that you don't need to have any responsibility for your actions. It's like our culture, the laws of our culture are predicated on the idea, something like, people are conscious, people have experience, people make decisions and can be held responsible for them, that there's a free will element to it. And you can debate all that philosophically, and fine, but the point is that that is how we act, and that is the idea that our legal system is predicated on. And there's something...
And again, Peterson started out being interested in law, and so this is something that he comes back to often. And of course, the debate in Ontario about C-16, where this comes into, this again, very much a part of Peterson.
Deep about it, because you're subject to the law, but the law is also limited by you, which is to say that in a well-functioning, properly grounded democratic system, you have intrinsic value. That's the source of your rights. Even if you're a murderer, we have to say the law can only go so far because there's something about you that's divine.
And this again is the working out of the Imago Dei in Genesis that came through Judaism, came through Christianity, became instantiated in our laws, is fully manifest in humanism, which, if you listen to Sam Harris, he's a humanist. If you listen to Brett Weinstein, he's a humanist. This humanism is a direct result of Christianity and a direct consequence of the Bible. And as Nicholas Waltersdorf, the point he made, if we lose the Imago Dei, will we lose humanism? And if we lose humanism, what will that look like? And anyone who's lived through the 20th century has got to have, got to be deeply concerned about this. Now, I've mentioned Yuval Harari and his books Sapien and Homo Deus. On one hand, his books are tremendously fun to read, but the end of Homo Deus is pretty chilling, and in terms of where this is going. And I appreciated Brett Weinstein's comments in the Joe Rogan about Google. We don't know where all this is going.
Well, what does that mean? Well, partly it means that there's something about you that's conscious and capable of communicating, like you're a whole world unto yourself, and you have that to contribute to everyone else, and that's valuable. I mean, that you can learn new things, you can transform the structure of society, you can invent a new way of dealing with the world. You're capable of all that. It's an intrinsic part of you, and that's associated with this. It's associated, that's the idea there, is that There's something about the logos that is necessary for the absolute chaos of the reality beyond experience to manifest itself as reality. It's an amazing idea because it gives consciousness a constitutive role in the cosmos. And you can debate that, but it's not, you can't just bloody well brush it off. Because first of all, we are the most complicated things there are that we know of by a massive amount. We're so complicated that it's unbelievable. And so, there's a lot of cosmos out there, but there's a lot of cosmos in here too. And which one is greater is by no means obvious unless you use something trivial like relative size, which really isn't a very sophisticated approach. And whatever it is that is you has this capacity to experience reality and to transform it, which is a very strange thing. You can conceptualize a future in your imagination.
And again, C.S. Lewis's book on miracles, how C.S. Lewis deals with nature. Nature is our brother or our sister, and nature is an accommodating host. That the way we talk, if you are a naturalist, materialist, none of our language makes sense anymore. But nature, we wade into nature and we change the world. And even in our language, if I hold up a paperclip, we say, this isn't natural. Well, if you're a naturalist, everything is natural. And so again, here, Peterson is dead on.
And then you can work and make that manifest. You participate in the process of creation. That's one way of thinking about it. And so that's why I think in Genesis 1, it relates the idea that human beings are made in the image of the divine, men and women, which is interesting too, because, the feminists are always criticizing Christianity, for example, as being, inexorably patriarchal. Of course, they criticize everything like that, so it's hardly a stroke of bloody brilliance. But I think it's an absolute miracle that right at the beginning of the document, it says straightforwardly, like with no hesitation whatsoever, that the divine spark, which we're associated.
And I'm going to kvetch at his use of the divine spark. It's a fairly specific term. You'll find it in the Quaker movement, for example. I think, and this is where someone with a theological education starts to kvetch, because someone with the imago Dei, I would rather say, than a divine spark. But his point here, though, too, about man and the woman he made, he made in his image, he made them, is really important. And I think if say you read that and you read, say, Gilgamesh alongside of it, and Enkidu and the shrine prostitute, and what struck me when I first read Gilgamesh was how Gilgamesh is this, it's almost a buddy story. The two main characters in Gilgamesh are basically, it's Gilgamesh and the gods make a helpmeet for Gilgamesh, and it's Enkidu, it's another man. Now both of these guys, I mean, they're getting plenty of sex, they're going and doing manly things, and it's jarring to read then Genesis 2, where God basically takes Eve out of, not his rib, the story almost cuts him in half. John Peugeot has a nice little icon on his video of Eve coming out of Adam's side, and I thought, wow, that's awesome. I love that image, because that's what the text is like, and then Adam sees bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, and you get this, well, this is even the conservative Christians who are complementarians, who don't believe in women in church office. Well, this is their great point, that men and women complement each other, that the helpmeet for a man is a woman. And that's I think in many ways a critique of Gilgamesh, where the helpmeet of a man is another man, and women are there to maybe civilize men with sex and prepare food for them and serve them. But women are, in Gilgamesh, almost a lesser creature. And again, you will find that throughout the ancient world. And here at the beginning of the Bible, you have the man and the woman are in the image of God. And whereas, and of course, equality is a very complicated subject, and I want to be careful with that right now. Men and women are both image bearers of God. And so there's in many ways a fundamental equality that you find right there in Genesis 1. And that equality, I think, in some ways has been a prophetic voice throughout the history of the church, that to the degree that the church does not own up to, equality is such a hard word, but does not own up to the equal status of women before God, the church has to answer for this. And so does the community. And again, you don't, to the people on the left who love to hear me say that about women, but don't imagine there's a divine judgment. I think you can't have one without the other. It's a united thing, and all cultures wobble around, and we get a few things right and we get a few things wrong, and some of the good stuff we forget, and some of the good stuff we pull back and remember, and that's just how life in the age of decay is. But there it is in Genesis.
Associating with the word that brings forth being is manifest in men and women equally. That's a very cool thing. And you got to think, well, like I said, do you actually take that seriously? Well, what you got to ask is, what happens if you don't take it seriously? Right? Read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. That's the best investigation of that tactic that's ever been produced. Because what happens in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is that the main character, whose name is Raskolnikov, decides that there's no intrinsic value to other people. And that as a consequence, he can do whatever he wants. It's only cowardice that stops him from acting. Right? Because why would it be anything else if the value of other people is just an arbitrary superstition? Then why can't I do exactly what I want when I want? Which is the psychopath's viewpoint. Well, so Raskolnikov does. He kills someone who's a very horrible person, and he has very good reasons for killing her. And he's half starved and a little bit insane and possessed by this ideology. It's brilliant, brilliant layout. And he finds out something after he kills her, which is that the post-killing Raskolnikov and the pre-killing Raskolnikov are not the same person even a little bit. Because he's broken a rule, like he's broken a serious rule, and there's no going back. And Crime and Punishment is the best investigation I know of what happens if you take the notion that there's nothing divine about the individual seriously.
And just a little interjection here, one of the things that's going to stalk us in this are questions about natural law. And in a sense, Peterson has just made a natural law argument.
Now, most of the people I know who are deeply atheistic, and I understand why they're deeply atheistic, they haven't contended with people like Dostoevsky, not as far as I can tell. Because I don't see logical flaws in Crime and Punishment. I think he got the psychology exactly right.
And that's an interesting comment too. I think, there's always this bias that we have, that the context and the worldview that we've been formed into, it's a self-serving bias, because we think, oh, that's obviously the superior one, but we hold that position because it's probably the only one we have, and whether you're an atheist or a Christian or some other religion, it's, at some point you've got to, like the Hobbit, get out your front door and go out into the world and meet some other people, and what the package that you were given by your parents and by the situation of your upbringing is going to be challenged, and what will you do with it?
And Dostoevsky's amazing for this, because in one of his books, The Devils, for example, he describes a political scenario that's not much different than the one we find ourselves in now. And there are these people who are possessed by rationalistic, utopian, atheistic ideas, and they're very powerful. They give rise to the communist revolution, right? I mean, they're powerful ideas. And his character, Stavrogan, also acts out the presupposition that human beings have no intrinsic nature and no intrinsic value. And it's another brilliant investigation, and Dostoevsky prophesies, that's what I would say, what will happen to a society if it goes down that road? And he was dead exactly accurate. It's uncanny to read Dostoevsky's The Possessed, or The Devils, depending on the translation, and then to read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, because one is fiction and prophecy, and the second is, hey, look, it turned out exactly the way that Dostoevsky said it would for exactly the same reasons. So it's quite remarkable. So the question is, do you contend seriously with the idea that A, there's something cosmically constitutive about consciousness, and B, that might well be considered divine, and C, that is instantiated in every person? And then ask yourself if you're not a criminal if you don't act it out. And then ask yourself what that means. Is that reflective of a reality? You know, is it a metaphor? Like maybe it's a metaphor, a complex metaphor that we have to use to organize our societies. Could well be, but even as a metaphor, it's true enough so that we mess with it at our peril.
And this again, Peterson's going right to his line, and this is when I listen to Peterson, I hear him working this stuff out, because is it just a metaphor? Is it but what even does that mean? And yeah.
And it also took people a very long time to figure out.
Okay, and now we're at 150, and now he moves on from there. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Did I get my slides unordered? Yes. And I think, you know, the one of the things I want to do is raise, you know, some of you. Well, I'll just share good things that I have. One of the, if you're interested in the Gospel of John, Raymond Brown's Anchor Bible series. If you're interested in biblical commentaries, don't buy series, generally speaking. You cherry pick some of the best books. And as you can see from Amazon, well, you can get some cheap. But this is a classic on the Gospel of John. Raymond Brown is a Roman Catholic scholar, and there were few who knew it's called in biblical studies the Johannine tradition better than Raymond Brown, and his 2-volume set on the Gospel of John is simply a classic. And on the Logos, there's a great appendix. Not getting any younger. There's a great appendix where he goes through and talks about the difficulty in determining the background of the first verse of the 4th Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, is illustrated dramatically in Goethe's Faust. When Faust begins to translate the New Testament into German, he starts with the prologue, only to find that word is an inadequate translation. His alternate suggestions come from the strange combination of Greek and German philosophy. In the beginning was the thought. In the beginning was the power. At the end, enlightened by the Spirit, Faust triumphantly proclaims the real translation, in the beginning was the act. Modern investigations into the background of the Johannine use of the word are as varied, if not as romantic. For reference to what follows, the reader's attention is called to the bibliography given in the prologue. And so then, and Raymond Brown starts then going through, the Hellenistic background, and this word has a powerful history. Heraclitus in Ephesus, and if you know anything about John studies, the Ephesus was kind of the center of perhaps the Johannine community. It was at Ephesus, the traditional site of John's Gospel, that Heraclitus in the 6th century BC first introduced logos into Greek philosophical thought, striving to explain the continuity amid all the flux that is visible in the universe. Heraclitus resorted to logos as the eternal principle of order in the universe. The logos is what makes the world a cosmos. For the Stoics, who are one of the, if you listen to N.T. Wright, I mean, the two big Greek philosophical traditions in Hellenism that really gripped the empire at this time, the Epicureans and the Stoics. For the Stoics, the Logos is the mind of God, a rather pantheistic God who penetrates all things, guiding, controlling, and directing all things. Philo, a Jewish philosopher who really tried to meld his Jewish upbringing and the Jewish faith with Platonism. Philo used the Logos theme over 1,200 times in his work in his attempts to bring together the Greek and the Hebrew worlds of thought. For Philo, the Logos created by God was the intermediary between God and his creatures. God's Logos was what gave meaning and plan to the universe. It was almost a second God, the instrument of God in creation and the pattern of the human soul. However, neither the personality nor the pre-existence of the Logos was clear in Philo, and the Philonian Logos was not connected to life. In the later Hellenistic literature, Logos was an expression of the mind of God, helping to create and order the world. In the Mandean liturgies, we hear the word of life or the light of life, etc. These are distant echoes of borrowing from Christian thought. As for the more general field of Gnosticism, the word occurs in the newly discovered gospel of truth. The word who came from the pleroma, who is in the thought and the mind of the Father, the Word who is also called the Savior. It is plausible that the Valentinian Gnostic use has been influenced by John, since the gospel of truth is considered later than John. In evaluating some of these examples, one must remember that the Gospel of John and some of these Hellenistic works had a common heritage in wisdom literature in the Old Testament, which certainly influenced Philo and some of the Gnostic odes, and that parallels can therefore be traced back to the Semitic roots. Again, the parallels between the prologue and the Hellenistic literature are often on the surface level. For example, the Logos is related to creation. The deep blending of the prologue motifs of Genesis 1 through 3, in the beginning, creation, light, life, darkness against light, and that of the Sinai theophany, tent or tabernacle, glory, enduring love, suggests that the basic imagery of the hymn comes from the Old Testament. The activity of the Word in creation, in the world, and above all in the history of salvation indicates that this concept is closer to the dynamic implications of the Hebrew dabar than the intellectual abstraction implicit in the philological usages of the Greek logos. When one reads the hymn of the prologue and compares it to the Hellenistic parallels suggested above, one realizes the truth of Augustine's remark from the Confessions, that while he found the equivalent of most Christian doctrines in pagan authors, there was one thing that he never read in them, that the Word became flesh. The basic theme of the prologue is strange to the Hellenistic parallels that have been offered, and so let us see a better background that may be found in biblical and Jewish thought. And then he goes into, again, the word of the Lord in the Old Testament, which is a major theme. It's a major theme in the prophets. The personification of wisdom in wisdom literature, both in extra-canonical Jewish literature and in the canonical literature in the Bible. Jesus as personified wisdom, and how wisdom in wisdom literature was there with God in creation. And so you hear that in John's prologue. The Jewish speculation of the law, and a little later in Peterson's thing, he'll go through his attributes of God. He's only got about 7 minutes to finish it up because he ran out of time, and I'm trying to remember back if he actually goes back over that carefully. I wish he would. Jewish speculation of the law, the relationship between the logos and the law, and then the Targum use, which was Aramaic of memra. When John cites scripture, as we've seen, sometimes the citation is taken from neither the Hebrew nor the Septuagint, which is the first century Greek translation of the Old Testament into the Greek, but from the Targums, or the Aramaic translations. In these Targums, memra, Aramaic for word, has a special function. The memra of the Lord in the Targums is not simply a translation of what we have spoken as of the word of the Lord. Rather, it is a surrogate for God himself. If you read in Colossians, if you read it in the Greek, that Jesus is the icon of the invisible God. And of course, for those in the Orthodox tradition who are used to dealing with icons, not from an iconoclastic tradition like more Protestant traditions, this surrogate for God himself. If in Exodus 3:12 God says, "I will be with you," in the Targum, God says, "My memra will be your support." In Exodus 19:17, we are told that Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. In the Targum, we are told that he was brought to the memra of God. If Genesis 28:21 says, "Yahweh shall be my God," the Targum speaks of the memra of Yahweh. This is not a personification, but the use of memra serves as a buffer for divine transcendence. And again, so when you see this, the Word becomes flesh in the Gospel of John, and you understand this, say, through the Targum and through the Aramaic, and we know that the author of the Gospel of John used the Aramaic translation often of the Old Testament. You can see this coming through now in this logos, in the Word of God. If Aramaic's expression word was used in Targum as a paraphrase for God and his dealings with men, the author of the prologue hymn may have seen fit to use this title for Jesus, who preeminently incorporated God's presence among men. The personification of the word would, of course, be part of the Christian theological innovation. In some, it seems that the prologue's description of the word is far closer to the biblical and the Jewish strains of thought than anything purely Hellenistic. In the mind of the theologian of the prologue, the creative word of God, the word of the Lord that comes to the prophets, has been personal in Jesus, who is the embodiment of divine revelation. Jesus is divine wisdom, pre-existent, but now come among men to teach them and give them life. Not the Torah, but Jesus Christ is the creator and source of light and life. He is the Memra, God's presence among men. And yet, even though all these strands are woven into the Johannine concept of the Word, this concept remains a unique contribution of Christianity. It is beyond all that has gone before it, even as Jesus is beyond all who have gone before. Before we close, we may ask about one more point. Is the revelation of God in the Word formulated against a background of God's previous silence? And then he goes into that, because part of what the first century Jewish community was straining with under their, in a sense, house arrest exile of the Roman Empire. Why has God not sent a prophet? Why has God not sent a voice, someone to rescue us? And then, of course, the New Testament, the gospel writers all begin with John. And is he a prophet? John says no. Is he a prophet? Jesus says yes. This is, again, another great example of the Bible having this conversation. Well, how can John and Jesus disagree? Well, they'll disagree on law, and they're going to talk about it, and they're going to work it through, and we're invited into the conversation to work these things through. Now, I wanted to end with this. Somebody that I've a friend I've recently made through making these videos, a pastor in Canada who I'm probably going to have a conversation with at one point, pointed me to this video that isn't in the Jordan Peterson thranel. It's in the John Peugeot channel, and it is an event that John and Jordan Peterson and some I know the Orthodox have their own terminology. The Orthodox priests spoke at this event, and so this is where Peterson gets into, because the topic of the event was the resurrection of the Logos, and part of what's so beautiful about the Orthodox tradition is that they haven't kind of been diced and sliced through all the different language transformations that, say, Protestants have had to go through, but part of what is beautiful about this is here's Peterson in a pulpit, which is really kind of funny, and what I really enjoy about, and I'll just play the part of this speech. I'll put the link for it in the notes. But what I enjoy about part of this speech is that he's so affected, and I wonder, as a preacher, sometimes you preach in some places and some contexts, and you're affected by the context. And I think this is Peterson, I think, in some ways opening his heart, and the sound quality isn't good, and that's not unusual for churches. But again, you can look up the video yourself and play the whole thing. But I just wanted to play the part that he talked about the Logos.
So I'm going to start with a hypothesis. And I spent a lot of time thinking about religious symbolism and archetypes. But there's a problem with that, and the problem is it lacks concretization. To think about the ultimate ideal as only something that's symbolic.
And again, I think this is where Peterson comes right up to his edge. And what does this mean? And the Word becomes flesh and tabernacles with us.
It moves away from the real world, and it's partly for this reason that there's an insistence in Christianity that the Logos is two things at once. It took me a long time to figure this out, and I was guided in my attempts to understand it by Carl Jung, who was a truly remarkable person, and probably orthodox in his fundamental convictions, I would say. He talked about the Logos as the thing that existed at the beginning of time, and this is a very particular way of looking at things. And so the idea is essentially that, as Jonathan pointed out, that there's something about consciousness that calls forth being from chaotic potential. And you all understand what this means, because when you look at the future, or if you look at yourselves, you know that what you confront is a field of potential, and everyone tells you that.
And I think when we dive into Genesis 1 more, this, I think, is a gospel articulation that especially the Protestant churches have not fully mined is the relationship with chaos in Genesis 1, and actually throughout the Old Testament and all the way to the book of Revelation where there isn't any sea. And this is something I think Peterson is making a contribution with.
They tell you, you're not living up to your potential. And potential is a very strange thing because it doesn't yet exist. And so by the canons of, say, modern science, it's not something that has any reality whatsoever, but everyone knows precisely what it means. And everything around you is full of potential because you can interact with it and bring forth new things. And you know that. And you can be called for your failure to do it. And you call out yourself for your failure to do it because you wake up at 3 in the morning and you torture yourself with your inability to bring forth the potential that's within you, and it haunts your soul, and it's hellish. And the reason it's hellish is because it is hellish. And if you don't call forth the potential that's within you and outside of you, then the world does transform into hell, because that's its tendency anyways. And we've had no shortage of evidence of that in the last 100 years. It's part of the Christian doctrine that at the beginning of time, the Logos of Yahweh operated on potential and brought forth the habitable world, order, and it was perfect. In some strange sense, it was the paradise in which Adam and Eve were placed, and the paradise was a walled garden, a well-watered place. And the walled garden is a place of order and chaos, culture and nature, and that's because people inhabit a garden of culture and nature. That's our environment, and if those two properties are properly balanced, then inside that garden everyone can flourish. And human beings are in principle made in the image of that Logos. And that's why we can speak things into being. And we do. And when you speak truth, then you speak paradise into being, and when you speak falsely, you speak hell into being. And that's the truth. And what that means is that with every decision that you make, you decide for yourself and for everyone else whether you're going to tilt the world a little bit more towards hell or a little bit more towards heaven. And that's the burden you bear for your existence and the choices that you make as you pass through life. And it's the fleeing from that that's at the bottom of the nihilism of postmodernism and the escape into the totalitarian certainties of idol worship. And none of this is fictional, because we've seen the consequences.
And I think that's just such a you listen to this guy and you don't get the sense he's being duplicitous. He is serious about what he's doing, and he believes it. And when he talks about, I believe him. I believe him when he talks about this, and it's this is his calling, and he's pursuing it. Where will it go? Will a new order come out of the chaos? I don't know. We'll see. So again, thanks for watching. And if you like it, if this helps you, just leave me a comment and just say, "Hey, I liked it," or you can say "you suck," or "shave," or "grow more hair," or just turn it off. But I, I I am processing this as part of my work process and asking if this is if this is fruitful. And so far I found it to be fruitful, and I'm again just really grateful for the comments and the new leads that this has brought me. So thanks for watching, and again, I hope it's helpful.